My name is Mara. I live in Brooklyn, and I'm somewhere in that in-between age where people assume you've either already made your mark or quietly accepted that you won't. I work in public administration, not the kind that makes headlines, the kind that keeps the lights on, the contracts clean, the paperwork boring enough that no one asks too many questions. If you passed me on the street, you wouldn't notice me. That's not false humility, it's just accurate. I don't look powerful, I don't sound aggressive, I don't dominate rooms. People tend to describe me with words like reliable, calm, easy to work with. Some mean it kindly, others mean it as a boundary. She won't be a problem. For a long time, I let that perception stand. Not because I lacked opinions or intelligence, but because I believed that integrity spoke for itself. That if you did your job carefully, ethically, without spectacle, the system would eventually reward you with trust. This story is about the moment I learned how wrong that assumption was. I want to be clear about what this is not. This is not a revenge story. There's no shouting, no dramatic takedown, no cinematic victory speech. There are no villains twirling mustaches or heroes riding in at the last second. What happened unfolded slowly, quietly, and mostly without witnesses. It's the story of how I reported a bribe on a public tender. Because it was my job, because it was the law, because I believed that was the end of my responsibility. It's also the story of how my badge stopped working that same afternoon. Security told me it was temporary. It never was. What follows isn't about anger. It's about disorientation, about realizing that the rules you followed precisely were never meant to protect you, only to test how much silence you could tolerate. It's about watching doors close without explanation, emails go unanswered, access evaporates while everyone insists nothing has changed. Most of all, it's about what happens when someone you underestimated stops asking to be seen and starts paying attention instead. I'm telling this now not to warn you away from honesty and not to scare you into compliance. I'm telling it because emotional justice doesn't always arrive with applause. Sometimes it arrives as clarity. Sometimes it arrives as quiet dominance, the kind that doesn't need permission or validation or an audience. This is a long story. It moves slowly because that's how real consequences move. If you're looking for drama, you might be disappointed. If you're looking for truth, the kind that sits heavy but steady, I think you'll understand why I stayed quiet for so long. Before we begin, let me ask you something gently without expectation. Have you ever done the right thing and felt the ground shift under you afterward, without anyone admitting it had moved? To understand what happened later, you have to understand who I was before. Not who I thought I was, but who I was to them. In the office, I was background noise in a sensible blazer. I wasn't invisible in the literal sense. People knew my name. They CC'd me on emails when compliance language was needed. They asked for my sign-off when a process required one more set of eyes. But I was never the point of focus. I wasn't the person people worried about impressing or offending. I sat near the end of the long conference table. Not because anyone told me to, but because no one stopped me. That's an important distinction. In organizations like ours, power isn't enforced loudly. It's arranged quietly, and everyone learns where they belong by watching who gets interrupted and who doesn't get invited at all. I was the one who listened. When vendors came in to pitch, I noticed how their tone changed depending on who asked the question. Senior directors got charm, legal got politeness edged with caution. I got efficiency. They spoke to me as you speak to a form that might reject you if you don't fill it out correctly, not like a person whose judgment could ripple outward. That was fine, or at least I told myself it was. I told myself I preferred it this way, less ego, less drama. I believed competence should be quiet, that if you did your work cleanly, you didn't need to assert yourself. I mistook lack of friction for respect. When meetings ran long, I was the one who summarized decisions so others could leave early. When there were contradictions in timelines or budget lines, I flagged them neutrally, carefully, without naming who had made the error. I thought that was professionalism. What I didn't realize, what took me too long to articulate even to myself, was that neutrality had become my defining feature. Not trust, not authority, neutrality. Harmless, predictable, safe. People shared things around me they wouldn't have said in front of someone they perceived as powerful. Side comments, half jokes. Assumptions were spoken aloud because no one thought I would challenge them. I absorbed all of it the way you absorb background radiation, slowly, without immediate damage, until one day you realize it's altered something fundamental. There was a phrase one of the project managers used that stuck with me. He said it casually, smiling, not even looking up from his laptop. "Mara will catch it if there's a problem. She always does." It was meant as praise. Everyone nodded. What no one said out loud was the second half of that sentence. "And if she does, it won't be a big deal." I didn't push back on deadlines. I didn't escalate the tone. I didn't posture. When I raised concerns, I did it in writing, calmly, with references and footnotes. I believed facts would speak louder than personalities. That belief shaped how people treated me. I became the place where issues went to soften, where sharp edges were rounded off before anything reached leadership. I was a buffer, a filter, a professional dampener. And buffers don't get credit when systems work. They only get noticed when something breaks. Outside the office, my life looked similarly unremarkable. A small apartment, a routine, a sense of having chosen stability over spectacle. Friends described me as grounded. Family said I was doing well. No one worried about me. No one thought I needed protecting. That's another thing about being underestimated. It often comes wrapped in approval. I wasn't unhappy, but I was unused to being seen as consequential. So when I say that what happened later wasn't about revenge, I mean it. I didn't wake up one day wanting to expose anyone or burn anything down. I didn't feel wronged yet. I didn't feel threatened. I felt trusted to clean up quietly. And because I had built my identity around being reliable, around being the one who handled things without fuss, I didn't question the cost of that trust. I didn't ask who benefited most from my silence, at least not yet. Because at this stage, I still believed the system noticed integrity, even if people didn't. I still believed that being correct mattered more than being visible. I still believed that doing the right thing was its own protection. That belief is important. It's the foundation everything else cracked against. The first time something felt off, it was so minor I almost forgot it. Almost. It happened during a routine review meeting for a mid-sized public infrastructure tender. Nothing glamorous, street-level improvements, the kind of project that attracts a predictable mix of vendors, some earnest, some aggressive, some clearly treating the process as a formality. I had flagged a discrepancy in one of the bids, a small one, a line item that didn't match the supporting documentation. It wasn't an accusation, just a note. I'd written it the same way I always did. Neutral language, precise reference, no assumptions. When the meeting reached that point, the project lead skimmed my comment on the shared screen and said lightly, "That's probably just a formatting thing." Probably. He didn't look at me when he said it. He didn't ask me to elaborate. He didn't assign anyone to verify it. He moved on. The room followed him without hesitation. No one challenged it. No one asked a question. The discrepancy passed into the category of things we assumed were harmless, because it was more comfortable to assume that than to pause momentum. I remember the exact sensation in my body. Not anger, not embarrassment. It was something quieter, a brief internal recalibration, like noticing a hairline crack in glass and telling yourself it's fine because it hasn't shattered. After the meeting, I sent a follow-up email, one paragraph, polite, clear, attaching the relevant page. I didn't CC leadership. I didn't escalate. I still believed in the courtesy of giving people a chance to correct small things privately. The response came 2 days later. "Noted. We'll keep an eye on it." That was it. No confirmation, no action item, no request for further review. I told myself it wasn't personal, that everyone was overloaded, that this was how efficiency worked at scale. You couldn't stop for every small irregularity. But here's the thing I didn't say out loud at the time. If it had been someone else raising the same point, someone with a different kind of authority, the conversation would have slowed. Not stopped, slowed. There would have been a brief discussion, a clarification, a moment of visible consideration, not because the issue was bigger, but because the messenger was. That realization didn't arrive as resentment. It arrived as data. I started noticing patterns after that. When I spoke early in meetings, my points were acknowledged but rarely expanded on. When I spoke later, they were sometimes repeated by someone else, slightly rephrased, and received with more enthusiasm. I didn't interrupt to claim credit. I told myself the outcome mattered more than attribution. But attribution is how systems decide who is worth listening to next time. A week later, the same vendor submitted an amended document. The discrepancy was gone. quietly corrected. No explanation offered, no note thanking compliance for catching it. That should have reassured me. Instead, it unsettled me, because it meant two things were true at once. They had heard me, they had chosen not to engage with me. That was the first cut. Small, clean, easy to dismiss. No one was cruel. No one raised their voice. No policy was violated. If I had complained, I would have sounded oversensitive. If I had escalated, I would have been told I was overreacting. And that's how these things work. Not with obvious harm, but with plausible deniability. I remember standing by the printer that afternoon, waiting for a stack of documents, thinking, if something serious ever comes across my desk, will it be handled the same way? I didn't like where that question led, so I pushed it aside. I went back to work. I stayed professional. I didn't change my tone or my behavior. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't keep score. But I remembered. That's the part people underestimate about quiet people. They assume silence means absence. They don't realize it often means storage. At that point, I still believed this was an exception. A minor misstep in an otherwise functional system. I still believed respect was cumulative, that if I kept doing my job well, moments like this would correct themselves. I didn't know yet that the system was already categorizing me, not as a risk, not as an obstacle, as someone whose discomfort was manageable. What makes subtle disrespect dangerous isn't the impact of any single moment. It's how easily it becomes routine. After that first incident, nothing dramatic happened. There was no retaliation, no warning, no shift obvious enough to point to. That was almost worse. Because without a clear rupture, your mind works hard to maintain the illusion of normalcy. I told myself I was being sensitive, that I was projecting meaning onto neutral behavior. I doubled down on professionalism. If I was going to be taken seriously, I reasoned, it would be because my work left no room for dismissal. So I became even more careful. I documented everything. Not defensively, at least that's what I told myself, but thoroughly. I cross-referenced emails. I summarized verbal conversations in writing afterward for clarity. I made sure every concern I raised was tied to policy language, procurement law, or prior precedent. Outwardly, nothing changed. Inwardly, I was adjusting. The dismissals continued, just slightly repackaged. Comments like, "We'll circle back if it becomes an issue," or "Let's not slow this down unless we have to," or my least favorite, delivered with a smile, "You worry because that's your job." That one stuck with me. It framed diligence as anxiety, compliance as neurosis. It recast my role not as protection but as friction, something to be managed, not respected. What made it harder to confront was that these comments were often followed by reassurance. Praise for my thoroughness, appreciation for my reliability. It created a cognitive fog. How do you object to being thanked? So I normalized it. I told myself this was just how organizations worked, that influence belonged to those with budgets and titles, that my responsibility was to advise, not insist. I convinced myself that restraint was maturity. There's a particular loneliness in being the only one who remembers unresolved issues. I would see a vendor's name come up again months later and recall the earlier discrepancy, how it had been brushed aside, then quietly corrected. I'd wonder what else had been smoothed over without discussion. But without explicit proof of wrongdoing, raising concerns felt speculative. And speculation in my position was risky. Risky not because it was forbidden, but because it would mark me as difficult. So I stayed measured. I chose my words carefully. I waited for certainty before speaking. I let small things go in the name of pragmatism. Each time I did, it became easier to do it again. That's how normalization works. You don't decide to accept disrespect. You decide repeatedly that now is not the moment to challenge it. The office culture rewarded speed and confidence. Questions slowed things down. Doubt was seen as inefficiency. The people who moved fastest were the ones least inclined to examine details that complicated timelines. And because I wasn't punished outright, I had no clear signal to stop. There was no open hostility to react against. Just a gradual narrowing of the space where my voice had weight. I noticed I was being looped in later on decisions, sometimes after drafts were nearly final, sometimes after informal agreements had already been made. My role became confirmatory rather than consultative. Again, no one announced this shift. It happened organically, conveniently. I rationalized it by telling myself they trusted me to catch issues at the end. that I was being spared unnecessary meetings, that this was efficiency, not exclusion. But deep down, something else was happening. I was being conditioned to accept that my role was to tidy, not to shape, to validate, not to question, to absorb responsibility without authority. I didn't confront anyone because there was nothing overt to confront. No sentence I could quote without sounding petty. No policy violation to cite. The disrespect lived in tone, timing, and omission. And so I adjusted myself instead. I spoke less and less spoken to. I softened language even further. I stopped expecting engagement and started measuring success by the absence of conflict. I told myself that staying employed mattered more than being heard. This is the part that's hardest to admit now. I participated in my own diminishment, not because I lacked courage, but because I believed patience was a virtue, and that systems eventually correct themselves. I hadn't yet learned that some systems don't correct. They test. They see how much pressure you'll absorb without pushing back. They see whether you'll confuse being reasonable with being expendable. And at this point, I was still passing that test. There's a moment, quiet, internal, when you realize you've been cast in a role you never auditioned for. For me, it came during a planning session I hadn't been invited to. I only found out about it afterward, when a colleague mentioned it casually in the break room. She wasn't being secretive. She assumed I knew. Everyone else who needed to be there had been. When I asked what had been decided, she gave me a summary. Not maliciously, just efficiently, as if the details were already settled facts, and my understanding was a formality. I nodded. I thanked her. I went back to my desk. That was when it clicked. I wasn't being excluded because I was unimportant. I was being excluded because I was predictable. They knew what I would say. They knew I would flag risks, cite policy, and ask for clarification. And they had already decided that those steps were optional until later. My role was no longer to influence outcomes. It was to legitimize them after the fact. Reliable, useful, and visible. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. I noticed how often I was brought in to clean up language after deals had been informally shaped. How my feedback was welcomed when it aligned with momentum, and deferred when it didn't. How people framed decisions as irreversible before I ever weighed in. I wasn't in the room when choices were made. I was in the room when they needed to look responsible. No one said this explicitly. No one needed to. Systems don't require confession, they require compliance. And I was compliant. Not because I agreed, but because I hadn't yet named what was happening. I told myself this was just hierarchy. That everyone had a lane and this was mine. That not everyone could be at the center. That influence didn't always look like visibility. But there's a difference between quiet influence and quiet erasure. The clearest sign came when I raised a concern about a timeline that violated procurement guidelines. I wasn't dramatic, I wasn't accusatory. I simply pointed out that the window was too narrow to meet statutory requirements. The response was immediate and unsettlingly calm. We'll take responsibility for that. Not let's fix it, not what do you suggest? Just, we'll take responsibility. It was meant to reassure me, to relieve me of obligation, to tell me my job was done. But responsibility without correction is just a promise to absorb consequences, often by someone who won't actually bear them. In that moment, I understood my assigned function. I was there to be heard just enough to say I had been consulted, not enough to change direction. I didn't argue. I didn't escalate. I wrote my follow-up email documenting the concern and the response. I filed it away. Still, I didn't see myself as marginalized. That word felt too dramatic, too loaded. I wasn't mistreated. I was treated politely. That's what makes this kind of role assignment so effective. It doesn't bruise the ego. It soothes it. It makes you feel included while systematically limiting your impact. And because I valued harmony, because I believed in institutional good faith, I accepted the role with minimal resistance. I told myself I was protecting my position, that being flexible was strategic, that influence could be exerted slowly, over time. What I didn't realize was that time was being used against me. The longer I stayed in that role without challenging it, the more it became the expectation. The more my silence was interpreted as consent. The more my presence became procedural rather than substantive. I wasn't seen as a threat. I wasn't seen as an obstacle. I was seen as a safeguard, one that could be bypassed until needed. And that perception would matter deeply when something crossed my desk that couldn't be softened, postponed, or politely ignored. Because when you've been assigned the role of useful but quiet, the moment you refuse to stay in character feels, to others, like betrayal. At this stage, I still believed I could manage that tension when it came, that I could assert boundaries without consequences, that my track record of reasonableness would protect me. I didn't yet understand how quickly a system can turn on someone who steps outside the role it was designed for them. The day something shifted didn't announce itself. There was no argument, no raised voices, no email marked urgent. It arrived the way most irreversible changes do, quietly, disguised as routine. I was reviewing a new public tender, larger than the ones I usually handled. Multi-year, high visibility, the kind of project that attracted not just vendors, but also interest, political interest, institutional interest, the kind that hums beneath the surface of official language. At first, nothing stood out. The documents were polished, the numbers aligned, the timelines were ambitious but defensible. If I had skimmed, if I had treated it the way others expected me to, I would have signed off and moved on. But something made me slow down. It wasn't suspicion. It was pattern recognition, a subtle familiarity in how certain requirements were worded. Not illegal, not overtly biased, just specific in a way that narrowed the field without appearing to. I cross-checked past tenders, then the older ones, then one from another department entirely. That's when I felt it, that internal click, not fear, not excitement, clarity. The same vendor, again and again, different projects, different scopes, same quiet advantages built into the criteria. Always just enough to edge out competitors, always defensible on paper. I sat back in my chair and stared at the screen longer than necessary. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a shortcut. This was designed. Still, I didn't jump to conclusions. I told myself there could be an explanation. Institutional preference, familiarity, efficiency, all the usual rationalizations that keep systems running without friction. So I did what I always did. I documented. I mapped criteria across tenders. I noted deviations. I compared scoring frameworks. I didn't accuse. I observed. The more I observed, the quieter the room felt. There's a moment when information stops being abstract and starts being personal, not because it involves you, but because you understand what it will require of you. I realized then that this wasn't something I could soften. I couldn't phrase it gently or wait it out. This wasn't a "we'll keep an eye on it" situation. If I acknowledged what I was seeing, even internally, I would eventually have to choose. And choice changes things. I remember closing my laptop and going to the restroom. Not because I was overwhelmed, but because I needed physical distance from the screen. I washed my hands slowly. I looked at myself in the mirror. I didn't look different. I didn't feel heroic. I felt steady. That surprised me. There was no surge of adrenaline, no righteous anger. Just a quiet understanding that the version of me who had relied on being agreeable wouldn't survive this intact. For the first time, silence felt like a decision, not a default. I went back to my desk and opened my notebook. The worn leather one I rarely used in public. I didn't write conclusions. I wrote questions, dates, references, connections. I didn't tell anyone what I'd found. Not yet. The shift wasn't external. No one treated me differently that day. No door closed. No warning lights flashed. The shift was internal. I stopped assuming the system would correct itself. I stopped assuming neutrality was protection. I stopped assuming I had time. From that moment on, every interaction carried new weight. Every dismissal I'd normalized before now had context. Every role I'd accepted felt provisional. I still did my job. I still smiled. I still spoke calmly in meetings. But something fundamental had changed. I was no longer waiting to be heard. I was deciding when and if to speak. And that decision once made cannot be unmade. After that day, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been passive, habitual, a side effect of wanting to be reasonable. Now it was deliberate, measured, chosen. Outwardly, nothing about me shifted enough to attract attention. That was important. I kept my routines. I attended the same meetings. I asked the same kinds of questions, just fewer of them, and only when they served a purpose. What changed was what I didn't say. I stopped volunteering observations that would alert people to how closely I was looking. I stopped flagging small issues that could be used as proof of overcaution. I let others assume everything was proceeding normally. They interpreted my quiet as relief. I could feel it in the room, the ease, The way conversations flowed more smoothly when I didn't interrupt the momentum with qualifiers or citations. Someone even commented lightly that things felt less tense lately. I smiled and nodded. Silence, when chosen, is often mistaken for surrender. That misunderstanding created space. I used it carefully. I began separating what was necessary to say from what was merely accurate. Not everything true needs to be spoken immediately. Not when speaking too early strips you of leverage. I kept documenting, but differently. Not just discrepancies, but reactions. Timing. Who moved quickly and who hesitated. Who assumed compliance would be automatic. I noticed how often decisions were framed as urgent right before scrutiny would have been required. How frequently was it diffused just enough that no single person appeared accountable? None of this was illegal on its own. That's the part people misunderstand. Systems rarely collapse because of one obvious crime. They erode through alignment of incentives and mutual avoidance. And I was watching that alignment take shape. People began to treat my presence as confirmation. If I didn't object, they assumed approval. If I didn't follow up, they assumed closure. They had learned my patterns well, and they hadn't noticed when I changed them. There's a quiet power in being underestimated during a pause. No one rushed to loop me in. No one checked whether I was comfortable with the decisions. They had already decided I was. In meetings, I listened more than I spoke. When I did speak, I asked questions that seemed procedural but were actually clarifying. I let others explain themselves in their own words. I didn't correct, I recorded. This wasn't manipulation, it was patience. I wasn't gathering ammunition. I was gathering truth, unaltered by defensiveness or performance. People reveal more when they think they're safe from consequence. And they felt safe with me, because I had spent years teaching them they could. At times, I wondered if I was being unfair, if my restraint was a form of deception. But each time that doubt surfaced, I reminded myself, transparency without protection is self-sacrifice, not integrity. I still believed in ethics. I just no longer believed they operated on intention alone. Silence gave me something I'd never had before: perspective without interruption. I could see how quickly the system moved when it believed there would be no resistance, how corners were rounded, how justifications layered over one another until no one remembered who had made the initial call. And through it all, I remained unremarkable. That was the point. Because when people think you've accepted your role, they stop monitoring you. They stop managing impressions. They stop explaining. They tell you more than they mean to. By choosing silence, I wasn't disappearing. I was repositioning. What they never noticed wasn't a single action. It was a shift in where my attention lived. While they were watching timelines and optics, I was watching behavior. I began to see the system as it actually functioned, not as it was described in policy manuals or onboarding decks. I saw who deferred to whom without being told, who spoke confidently without documentation, who never put certain things in writing. Most importantly, I noticed who assumed I would stay where I was. Preparation didn't look like plotting. It looked like consistency. I kept doing my job, but I started building a parallel understanding of how information flowed. I mapped processes the way you map a building you've walked through every day but never needed to escape from, until suddenly you do. I tracked timelines across departments, not to accuse, but to understand rhythm. When things moved fast, when they slowed down, when exceptions became patterns. I learned which conversations happened in meetings and which happened before them. I noticed how often decisions were framed as already aligned before alignment had actually occurred. I didn't interrupt that process, I observed it. People are more honest when they believe the listener lacks power. That belief was my camouflage. Emails were revealing. Not just what was written, but what was omitted. Who was CC'd, who was left out, who responded quickly, and who waited until someone else spoke first. I kept copies, not obsessively, methodically. I didn't store them in one place. I didn't label them dramatically. I didn't treat them as evidence yet. They were in context, raw material. What surprised me most was how little resistance I encountered. Not because there was none, but because no one imagined I would ever need to resist. I was still the same Mara to them, the one who caught small things, the one who didn't make noise, the one who could be trusted to handle it. They didn't notice when I stopped handling things quietly for them and started handling them carefully for myself. I read procurement law the way some people read novels, not to memorize, but to internalize structure. I learned where discretion ended and obligation began, where ambiguity protected decision makers and where it didn't. I learned how oversight bodies thought, what triggered reviews, what didn't, what mattered more than intent. None of this was secret knowledge. That's the irony. It was all available to anyone willing to read without assuming goodwill would fill in the gaps. I didn't tell colleagues what I was learning, not because I distrusted them individually, but because systems don't respond well to partial truth. You either stay silent or you commit fully. And I wasn't ready to commit yet. There were moments of temptation, times when I could have hinted, asked leading questions, tested reactions. But each time I stopped myself. Preparation loses power when it seeks validation. I also paid attention to myself, to how my body reacted in certain meetings, when I felt pressure to hurry, when discomfort was framed as an inconvenience. These signals mattered. They were the human layer beneath the process. The more I observed, the calmer I became. Fear thrives on uncertainty. Clarity dissolves it. By the time others sensed that something might be wrong, only in the vaguest way, I already knew exactly what was wrong, how it had formed, and what acknowledging it would require. What they never noticed was that while they believed I was maintaining the system, I was actually learning its limits, quietly, thoroughly, without asking permission. And once you know where a system bends, you also know where it breaks. I wasn't angry, I wasn't eager. I was ready. The reveal didn't come with shock. It came with confirmation. By the time I allowed myself to name what I'd been circling, there was no suspense left, only alignment. Every note I'd taken, every pattern I'd tracked, every omission I'd logged settled into place with a calm finality. This wasn't corruption in the cinematic sense. No envelopes exchanged in dark corners, no single villain pulling strings. It was something quieter, more institutional. A vendor had been signaling expectations through intermediaries, not demands, preferences. Certain criteria adjusted here. Timelines compressed there. Nothing that couldn't be justified individually. Everything that benefited the same outcome collectively. And then there it was. An email I hadn't been meant to see. Not because it was hidden, but because no one imagined I'd read it the way I did. A forwarded chain, stripped of context, casually attached to a scheduling note. It referenced a gesture, a show of appreciation, a reminder that support doesn't go unnoticed. No numbers, no explicit request, just enough to establish intent. I didn't react immediately. I didn't forward it, I didn't print it. I sat with it. I read it again, slowly, not looking for outrage, looking for precision. Language matters, especially when people think they're being subtle. This wasn't evidence yet, it was an implication. So I traced it backward. I looked at calendar invites, travel reimbursements, hospitality disclosures, cross-department overlaps. I didn't assume guilt, I followed the process. And eventually the implication hardened. A senior external consultant, one who advised on vendor suitability, had accepted a benefit tied to favorable positioning, not large, not dramatic, but undisclosed, and directly related to an active public tender. A bribe, in the language of the law. I closed my laptop and felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, not fear. Relief, because uncertainty was over. This was the private reveal, not to the world, not to leadership, not even to myself in an emotional sense. It was a structural reveal, the moment when facts aligned so cleanly that denial would require effort. I understood then why systems like this persist, not because people are evil, but because acknowledging the truth is inconvenient. It demands disruption. It forces clarity where ambiguity has been carefully cultivated. I also understood my position. I was not powerful enough to control the outcome, but I was positioned well enough to initiate it. That distinction matters. I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel righteous. I felt sober. Because once you truly see something like this, you lose the luxury of pretending neutrality. Silence stops being a shield and becomes a choice with consequences. I thought about the people involved, not as villains, but as individuals operating within incentives they hadn't designed but had learned to exploit. I thought about the public funds attached to the tender, the communities affected by the outcome, and I thought about myself, about the role I'd been assigned, about the trust I'd been given, about the line I would have to cross, not loudly, not dramatically, but irrevocably. I knew exactly what reporting this would mean, not in theory, in practice. I knew my credibility would be scrutinized. My motives are questioned, my past silence reframed as complicity. I knew the system would not thank me for introducing friction where it had grown comfortable. But I also knew this. If I didn't act, everything I had believed about my work would collapse. This wasn't about being brave, it was about being aligned. The reveal wasn't that corruption existed. The reveal was that I was no longer willing to look away from it. And once that decision settles in you, quietly, completely, there is no going back. People imagine decision points as moments of high emotion. Raised heart rate, sleepless nights, dramatic resolve. Mine was almost boring. Once the facts were clear, the choice narrowed quickly. Not because it was easy, but because there were fewer real options than it first appeared. I laid them out anyway, carefully, honestly. I could do nothing. Let the tender proceed. Let the system continue as it had before. That option came with short-term safety. No disruption, no attention, no consequences. At least not immediately. I could raise the issue informally, ask questions, hint, let someone with more visible authority take it from there. That option felt reasonable on the surface, but I knew how it would end. The concern would diffuse, responsibility would blur. The system would correct just enough to survive scrutiny without addressing the core issue. Or I could report it formally, not emotionally, not publicly, through the channels designed for exactly this situation. That option was the most disruptive and the most final. I didn't romanticize it. I didn't tell myself it would lead to justice or reform. I knew better by then. Reporting wasn't a guarantee of anything except consequences. So I took my time. I reviewed whistleblower protections. Not the summaries, the actual language. I looked at precedents, outcomes, retaliation cases that succeeded and those that failed. I didn't assume protection meant immunity. I assumed it meant process. I also reviewed my own record, every email, every documented concern, every moment when I had raised an issue and was dismissed, not to justify myself, but to understand how my past would be interpreted. I saw clearly how my history of restraint could be reframed as selective concern. How my quiet could be questioned, how my timing could be scrutinized. That was the cost. I accepted it. The decision, when it finally arrived, didn't feel like courage. It felt like alignment clicking into place, like choosing not to fracture myself further to preserve comfort. I didn't tell anyone I was considering it. Not friends, not colleagues, not family. This wasn't secrecy. It was containment. I needed the decision to exist without commentary. The morning I submitted the report, my routine didn't change. I woke up at the same time. I made coffee. I took the subway. I sat at my desk. I filled out the disclosure form slowly, attached documentation, referenced policies, used neutral language, no adjectives, no speculation. Just facts, just structure, just enough. I didn't add commentary about intent. I didn't accuse anyone of character flaws. I let the framework do its work. When I clicked submit, there was no rush of relief. There was stillness. Not peace, but steadiness. I knew this action would set things in motion that I couldn't control. I knew it would expose me to a system that tolerated compliance but resisted disruption. But I also knew something else, something quieter and more important. From this point on, whatever happened would happen to me, not through me. I wouldn't be absorbing pressure meant for others. I wouldn't be smoothing consequences that weren't mine to bear. That knowledge settled in my chest like a weight redistributed. Not removed, just carried correctly. I closed the browser. I opened my inbox. I went back to work. No one around me knew that a line had been crossed. Not yet. After I reported it, nothing happened. At least nothing that looked like something. That's the part no one prepares you for, the delay, the uncanny calm after an irreversible action. No confirmation beyond an automated receipt. No questions, no sudden tension in the room. If anything, the days that followed felt smoother. Meetings stayed cordial. Emails stayed polite. Timelines advanced as planned. The tender moved forward, untouched on the surface. The system did what systems do best when challenged quietly. It pretended nothing had changed. I understood that this was not inaction. It was processing. Investigations don't announce themselves. They gather. They triangulate. They verify independently. And while that happens, the subject of the report becomes a variable, observed but not informed. So I moved carefully. I didn't alter my behavior in ways that could be read as defensive or anticipatory. I didn't suddenly disengage. I didn't overperform. I stayed consistent. Predictability was my shield. What changed was invisible. I stopped initiating optional conversations. I kept my calendar lean. I made sure every professional interaction had a clear purpose, not to isolate myself, but to avoid ambiguity. I backed up my files, not dramatically, not all at once, just enough that nothing existed in only one place. I reviewed access permissions, not to restrict, but to understand. I paid attention to policy language around temporary measures, suspension of access, reassignment of duties, administrative discretion. Words that sounded harmless until you imagined them applied to yourself. I didn't panic. Panic makes people sloppy. Instead, I prepared for friction. There's a difference between expecting retaliation and understanding institutional reflex. Organizations don't like disruption, even when it's lawful. They don't move toward discomfort unless pushed. And even then, they often push back first. I didn't know who had been notified yet. Oversight bodies rarely share timelines. That uncertainty could have been destabilizing, but by then, I trusted my documentation more than my intuition. I also noticed small things. A meeting I'd usually attend was rescheduled without me. A request for input was rerouted through a manager. Nothing egregious, nothing I could point to as retaliation. This is just subtle repositioning. It reminded me of earlier patterns, the gradual narrowing of influence. Except this time I wasn't internalizing it as a personal failure. I recognized it for what it was: insulation. The system creates distance. I didn't confront it. Confrontation would have signaled anxiety. Instead, I let the distance exist and took note of its shape. Silence once again worked in my favor. People assume silence means you don't see what's happening. They mistake composure for ignorance. They think if you're not objecting, you're not aware. I was aware. I was also patient. Because once you've acted within the rules, your power no longer comes from movement. It comes from restraint, from letting others reveal how they respond to pressure. And they were responding, just not loudly. I continued showing up, doing my job, being exactly as unremarkable as I'd always been. Which is why, when the first real consequence arrived, it caught everyone else off guard, including me, just not in the way they expected. The first consequence didn't arrive as punishment. It arrived in confusion. One morning, my badge didn't scan. I stood there longer than necessary, assuming it was user error. I tried again, then once more. The small red light blinked back at me, indifferent. A security guard approached, polite but distracted. He asked for my name, checked a tablet, and nodded. "It's probably temporary," he said. Said system update or something. Temporary. That word is designed to soothe. It implies intention, resolution, a return to normal. He let me in manually and waved me through. I went to my desk. Everything else worked. Email access, files, calendar, no alerts, no explanation, no follow-up. I told myself not to overinterpret it. By lunchtime, my building access was restored, but my internal systems access wasn't. I noticed it when I tried to open a procurement archive I used regularly. The permissions error was brief and generic. I refreshed. Same result. I checked another folder, then another. Access denied. Still no message, no notification, no reason given. I emailed IT, framed it as a technical issue, asked if there had been a change in role-based permissions. The response came hours later. "We're looking into it." That was all. Over the next few days, similar things happened. Not to me directly, but around me. Meetings I had been scheduled for were streamlined. My role shifted from contributor to observer. Documents arrived already finalized. Requests for my review came with shorter windows. Or not at all. People around me felt something was off, but they didn't connect it to me. They were experiencing inconvenience without context. A deadline slipped because the compliance review took longer elsewhere. A clarification stalled because no one knew who now held the authority to sign off. Frustration surfaced, but it floated, unattached to cause. I watched this happen with a strange sense of detachment, because I understood something they didn't yet. Systems rarely retaliate directly. They reroute. They don't remove you loudly. They make you less central. They reduce your access, your visibility, your usefulness, then act surprised when things slow down. What struck me most was how quickly my absence was felt, and how little my presence had been acknowledged before. Colleagues asked where certain documents were. Who had handled similar cases in the past? Why were taking longer? No one asked me, not because they didn't trust me, but because they had already adjusted. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even hurt. I was observant. Because these were not random disruptions, they were consequences, just not aimed at me in the way people expect consequences to look. The system was insulating itself from risk by limiting my reach. And in doing so, it was quietly revealing how much labor I had been absorbing without recognition. I still showed up, I still worked, I still documented. But now, every small denial carried weight. Every unexplained delay added texture to a pattern I recognized well. This wasn't punishment yet. This was containment. And containment is never the final stage. Containment didn't stay quiet forever. It never does. At first, the system believed it could manage the disruption by narrowing my access, redistributing my responsibilities, and smoothing over the gaps I left behind. That approach works when someone is replaceable in a clean way. I wasn't. Not because I was extraordinary, but because I had been consistent for a long time. I knew the history of decisions that were never written down. I remembered why certain clauses existed. I understood which exceptions were harmless and which ones were structural risks. When that knowledge disappeared from the center of the process, confusion followed. People started asking questions they hadn't needed to ask before. Not philosophical ones, practical ones. Where was the precedent for this? Who had approved that deviation last year? Why did this vendor score higher when the criteria hadn't changed? These weren't accusations, there were delays. Deadlines slipped. Reviews looped back on themselves. Managers grew impatient, not with wrongdoing, but with inefficiency. And inefficiency demands explanation. That's when the tone shifted. I noticed it in meetings I attended only as an observer. The tightness in voices, the way people began to speak more carefully, the sudden interest in process alignment and documentation standards. Someone mentioned oversight, not casually, cautiously. I wasn't included in those conversations, but I didn't need to be. Systems broadcast stress through language long before they admit cause. Then came the first attempt to fix it. A manager asked to meet with me one-on-one, framed as a check-in, a chance to realign. The language was gentle, collaborative, concerned. They asked how I was feeling, whether I felt supported, whether anything had been frustrating me lately. I listened. They didn't mention the badge. They didn't mention access. They didn't mention the report because they couldn't. They spoke as if we were still operating in the old reality, where tone adjustments could smooth everything out. I answered honestly, but narrowly. I said I was doing my work. I said I'd noticed some changes in access. I asked whether they were temporary. There it was again. Temporary. They assured me things would stabilize soon, that the organization was working through some things, that everyone valued my professionalism. It was an attempt at closure without acknowledgement. I didn't push. Pushing would have been premature. What they didn't realize was that the moment for internal correction had already passed. Once a formal report enters oversight channels, internal reassurances become irrelevant. You can't unring that bell. You can't quietly restore balance without addressing the source of disruption. And the source wasn't me. Days later, I heard about an external inquiry. Not officially, but through the shift in behavior it caused. Calendars suddenly filled. Legal language appeared in emails. People who rarely documented anything began documenting everything. Panic doesn't always look like chaos. Sometimes it looks like overorganization. That's when regret surfaced. Not remorse, but miscalculation. They hadn't thought I would go that far. They hadn't thought I would act alone. They hadn't thought my silence meant capacity. By the time they understood, it was too late to reposition me back into my old role. Too late to reframe my concerns as misunderstandings. Too late to fix it quietly. Because the system had already shown its hand. And oversight bodies don't forget that. I watched this unfold without satisfaction, without bitterness. Just clarity. This was no longer about what I had done. It was about what could no longer be undone. The confrontation, when it finally came, was almost anticlimactic. No raised voices, no accusations, no dramatic reveal. Just a meeting request, brief, neutral, unavoidable. It was scheduled with 2 senior administrators and someone from legal. The subject line was vague. Process clarification. I arrived on time, sat where I was directed, placed my notebook on the table, unopened. They spoke first. They thanked me for my years of service, for my professionalism, for my discretion. The words were careful, measured. Every sentence is designed to acknowledge without admitting. Then they asked me to walk them through my understanding of a specific procurement process. Not the issue, not the report. A process. I answered calmly. Precisely. I cited policy language. I referenced standard practice. I didn't speculate. I didn't editorialize. They listened. When I finished, one of them asked, almost gently, whether I had any concerns about how that process had been applied recently. There it was. The opening. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't list grievances. I didn't frame myself as wronged. I said simply that when I encounter irregularities that meet reporting thresholds, I follow the required procedure. Nothing more. Silence followed, not awkward intent. Legal cleared their throat. Someone asked whether I felt pressured to report. I said no. Someone asked whether I had attempted to resolve the issue internally first. I said I had documented concerns consistently over time. No accusations, no names, no emotion. The room felt different after that. Heavier, but clearer. They weren't angry. They were recalibrating. Because this wasn't a confrontation about behavior. It was a confrontation about control. About the moment when someone they believed predictable demonstrated autonomy. They shifted tactics. They spoke about culture, about trust, about how difficult these situations can be for everyone involved, about the importance of unity during review processes. I listened. Then I said something I hadn't planned, but that felt true. I said that unity without integrity doesn't hold. And that process exists precisely so individuals don't have to negotiate ethics in isolation. It wasn't defiant, it wasn't emotional, it was factual. No one argued. The meeting ended shortly after. No resolution offered, no threats made, no assurances given. But something important had happened. I had not defended myself. I had not justified my decision. I had not asked for understanding. I had simply stood in alignment with the role I was meant to play, not the one assigned to me. And they knew it. As I left the room, I understood that whatever happened next would not be about me personally. It would be about the system adjusting to a variable it could no longer manage quietly. That was enough. I didn't walk out of that meeting feeling victorious. I walked out lighter, not because anything had been resolved, but because something had been released. The version of me that needed to be understood. The version that hoped professionalism alone would translate into protection. That version didn't follow me anymore. In the weeks that followed, my role changed, formally this time. Reassignment, reduced scope. A temporary restructuring that, like other temporary things, came without a clear endpoint. I accepted it without protest. Not because I agreed, but because resistance wasn't required. The work I had needed to do was already done. People often assume that standing up for something means you gain power afterward. Sometimes you don't. Sometimes you lose proximity, access, familiarity. What you gain instead is definition. I knew exactly who I was now, because I had tested it. I was no longer the quiet buffer absorbing pressure for others. I wasn't the invisible safeguard smoothing over discomfort. I wasn't the person people relied on to make risk disappear without consequence. I was someone who had acted in alignment with her values when it mattered. That alignment changed how I moved through the world. I became more selective about where I invested energy, more attentive to structure than to sentiment, less interested in being liked, more interested in being clear. Outside of work, I noticed the difference too. In conversations, in boundaries, in how quickly I disengaged from dynamics that relied on my silence to function. I wasn't hardened, I wasn't bitter, I was precise. The investigation continued beyond my involvement. Outcomes came later, and not all of them were satisfying. Systems rarely deliver clean endings. There were compromises, quiet departures, policy updates framed as routine improvements. But something fundamental shifted, not just in the organization, but in me. I understood now that quiet dominance isn't about control or intimidation. It's about internal authority, about knowing when to speak, when to wait, and when to act without needing consensus. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't shame anyone, I didn't demand recognition. I simply stopped betraying myself to maintain comfort. That's the part no one prepares you for. The way integrity changes your posture long after the moment is past. How it reorganizes your sense of time. How it clarifies what you will and won't trade away. I'm still in Brooklyn. I still walk the same streets. My life looks ordinary from the outside. But I am not the same person who once believed that being agreeable was the same as being safe. I know now that systems don't protect integrity by default. People do, individually, quietly, often without applause. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is accept the cost without negotiating your values down. That's who I am now. There's a temptation, when a story like this ends, to look for a lesson that feels clean, something you can carry away neatly, like advice folded into a sentence. I don't have that. What I have instead is a quieter understanding, one that took time to settle. For a long while after everything happened, I asked myself whether it had been worth it. Not in a dramatic way, just practically. I thought about the access I lost, the ease that disappeared, the way my career path narrowed instead of widening. Those are real costs. Pretending otherwise would be dishonest. But here's what I realized, slowly and without ceremony. Before, I was spending energy every day managing my own reduction, softening concerns, timing truths, making myself easier to overlook so that systems could remain comfortable. That kind of self-editing has a cost too. It just hides better. When I stopped doing that, something unexpected happened. My life became quieter, not externally, internally. I slept better. I trusted my own reactions again. I no longer replayed conversations wondering if I should have said something differently or at all. I stopped negotiating with myself in advance. That's not heroism, that's coherence. This story isn't meant to tell you to report something, or to stay silent, or to believe that integrity always leads to reward. It doesn't. What it does is change the relationship you have with yourself. There's a difference between being underestimated and being unknown. I was underestimated for a long time, and I accepted it because it felt safe. But safety built on erasure is fragile. It depends on your continued compliance. The moment you stop complying, the truth comes out. Not about you, but about the system you're in. I didn't win in a way that makes for headlines. I didn't become powerful in the way people usually mean that word. But I became something else. I became unmovable. Not stubborn, not defiant, just no longer available for roles that required my silence to function. That's what quiet dominance really is. It's not about making others smaller. It's about refusing to shrink. If you take anything from this, let it be this. Pay attention to where your silence is coming from. Is it patience or fear? Is it strategy or habit? Is it peace or avoidance? Silence can be wisdom. It can also be training. And the system you're in is always watching to see which one it is. I don't regret what I did. Not because the outcome was perfect, but because the cost of not acting would have been internal, permanent, and invisible to everyone but me. That's the cost I wasn't willing to pay anymore. If you've listened this far, I want to ask you something. Not to provoke, not to persuade, just to open space. Have you ever noticed yourself staying quiet? Not because you didn't know the truth, but because saying it would have changed how others saw you? And if so, what do you think that silence was really protecting?